Okay, we're going to raise the question today, did the New Testament authors paint Jesus back into the Hebrew Scriptures, into the Tanakh, what Christians call the Old Testament? We saw yesterday in the plainest and clearest ways that there is a consistent testimony of God through the Scriptures that points to the Messiahship of Jesus. The question is, were the New Testament authors faithful to that? Or did they have to invent other passages, other prophecies, try to put him where he didn't belong, etc., etc.? What does the Scripture actually say about that? So what we want to do is take a look in the New Testament itself, and begin to look at some of the citations from Matthew's Gospel in particular, because he's often the most attacked for allegedly taking verses out of context and twisting the meaning of the Hebrew Bible. We're going to start with Matthew and look at a number of key citations and ask, are these truly Messianic prophecies? Was Matthew right in his understanding? Or if all of the Scripture is in fact pointing to Yeshua, did Matthew rightly open it up and interpret it? Was his interpretation in keeping with first century Jewish methods of reading the Bible? Or is this a matter of a guy who really didn't know the Bible that well and certainly couldn't read Hebrew and just pull the verse out of context here and out of context there? You ever have Christians do that? They're trying to get guidance. Okay, God, what should I do? And you just point to a verse and read it. The works of his hands are faithful and just. Okay, that means God's calling me to work with my hands. I mean, is that what Matthew did? Is that how he functioned? Let's take a look at some of his citations. But if you look in your notes, under the section, Painting Jesus into the Old Testament with a question mark, I want to share with you some traditional Jewish perspectives on Matthew. Orthodox Jewish journalist David Klinghoffer, in his book Why the Jews Rejected Jesus, deals with the verses that Matthew cites in the early chapters of his book, allegedly pointing to Yeshua. Do they or do they not? This is what David Klinghoffer says. Remember, he's not a biblical scholar or a rabbinic scholar, but he's a solid thinking man and a journalist, now author as well. So this is what he says: pointing out the imprecision of proof texts like these, speaking of Matthew's, one feels almost unsporting. It's too easy. Yet it is with these that the New Testament begins its first attempt at a narration of the life of the Christian Messiah. Whoever the first educated Jews were to have these prophetic verses cited to them, whether in Jesus' lifetime or later, they could have only reacted with puzzlement and disbelief. As the song says, is that all there is? In other words, come on. I mean, Matthew's so obviously misquoting and taking things out of context. Anybody could see that. Here's what Rabbi Tovia Singer says. He claims, and these are general statements, and then where we have a verbatim quote, it's in quotes, that according to Rabbi Singer, one of the ironies is that there's no human being in history more responsible for the resistance of the Jewish people to convert to Christianity than Matthew. Of course, for Tovia Singer, it's any faith in Jesus is conversion to Christianity, not a legitimate Jewish expression. But we're just giving you his sentiments. There's no person in history more responsible for Jews being absolutely certain that Jesus is not the Messiah and that the New Testament is an unreliable document than Matthew. Matthew altered the Jewish scriptures to make them appear more Christological, pointing to Jesus. Now listen to this claim. This is a serious claim made by Tovia Singer. Today, other non-Christian religions are wreaking havoc on the Jewish people. New Age, Hare Krishna. They're able to evangelize Jews very easily. But, quote, the church has enormous difficulty to convert Jews because it makes the devastating mistake of saying, we can prove to you Jesus from the Old Testament. And if Matthew had not existed and had the whole idea of allegedly altering the texts, I say allegedly, Tovia Singer would say altering the text, if that had not existed, Jewish people might more willingly have converted or come to faith in Yeshua. These are pretty wild claims, especially when many Jewish people come to faith because of the prophecies, and others, once they have become believers, get strengthened in their faith because of the prophecies. And in all honesty, the majority of Jews who get saved without the prophecies initially. In other words, they have some encounter with God that's life-changing, and then discover that he's the one spoken of in the prophets. And even this notion that, say, for example, Hare Krishna and these other groups, New Age, are winning far more Jews to their cause than Jews are coming to Jesus. I mean, it's completely outlandish. However, this is the perception. This is a perception that Matthew did such a terrible job, and he was so obviously wrong, because Matthew in particular was writing for a Jewish audience to make them understand this is our Messiah. Remember, the Bible that they had was this, the Hebrew Scriptures. According to these gentlemen, Matthew did such a bad job at it that any educated Jew reading it would think, this is completely off the wall. I mean, obviously, this whole religion is wrong. Now, he continues, Tovia Singer again, how could Jews, speaking of Jews who chose death to conversion during the Crusades, how could they be so sure that heaven wasn't waiting for them behind that cross? They knew it. How could they be so certain that the teachings of Christianity had nothing to do with the teachings of the Jewish Scriptures? How could they be so sure that there was no relationship between Jesus of Nazareth and the Messiah prophesied and taught and preached by the Jewish prophets because of the words of Matthew and Paul? They were so bad in their interpretation of Scripture. They so misquoted, they so misused the text that Jews knew die rather than believe this stuff. Now, let's contrast this view with the views of W.D. Davies and Dale C. Allison Jr. You say, who are they? Well, they are some of the world's greatest Matthew scholars with very good grounding in Jewish studies, rabbinic literature as well. In fact, Davies was famous for opening up the New Testament in light of rabbinic literature. They wrote a 3-volume commentary on Matthew in the International Critical Commentary series that in total comes to about 2,200 pages. The most detailed, meticulous commentary on Matthew that I know of. In order to read it and understand everything that's cited, you need to know many different languages just to adequately use the commentary. They have a simplified 1-volume edition of it, but the full 3-volume, over 2,200 pages of massive, in-depth scholarship. And they are not fundamentalist believers. In other words, they're not just saying, well, if it's written in the New Testament, therefore it's so. They're examining everything critically, carefully, sifting, searching, understanding. They're very conversant with Jewish methods of interpretation in the first century. They know all of the critical issues and the objections to the faith, etc., etc. This is what they said. Tovia Singer is not a Matthew scholar. David Klinghoffer was not a Matthew scholar, nor do they claim to be. These are two of the finest Matthew scholars in the entire world. This is what he said. They said, Matthew was not above scattering terms in his Greek text whose deeper meaning could only be appreciated by those with a knowledge of Hebrew. Indeed, it might even be that Matthew found authorial delight in hiding bonus points for those willing and able to look a little beneath the gospel surface. Isn't that interesting? The guys who were the great scholars who examined this in meticulous detail concluded that not only did Matthew have brilliance in what he was doing, but he actually hid things that only those who really dug could find. It's like my illustration yesterday. If you've got no scientific background and no background in physics and the related fields, and someone presents to you Einstein's theory of relativity, E equals mc squared, and I've discovered something that's going to change the course of the 20th century, you think, this is silly. What is this? And even if you discovered something, it couldn't be that simple that it would go in a little formula. It couldn't be that no one has ever seen that. Well, in point of fact, the more you know, the more stunning the theory. In all honesty, and I say this again, as one who searches the Scriptures and who refuses to come up with cheap answers. I mean, I've had sleepless nights at times wrestling with issues because I'm not just going to try to come up with some cheap answer to answer the critics. I want to know, God, what is the right answer? What is truth? Where is truth going to lead us? And the more I would dig in Matthew's gospel, the more amazed I would be at his insights. the more amazed I would be at what he was really saying, the more amazed I would be, not trying to be amazed, because that's okay, that's a very fair question, that's a legitimate question, and the more I dig, the more impressed I was with where he was coming from. This is a quote from volume 4 of Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus. An analysis of the use of the Tanakh in the Dead Sea Scrolls, representing Jewish biblical interpretation contemporaneous with and immediately prior to the New Testament period, offers further support for this position. What position? The position that Matthew was a more sober interpreter of Scripture than were the rabbis of his day, and more sober interpreter than were the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, another Jewish group widely engaged in biblical interpretation in a similar time period and immediately before. This was the conclusion of Robert H. Gundry, a respected Christian scholar who painstakingly analyzed the citations from the Tanakh found in Matthew's Gospel, the Gospel most frequently attacked for alleged misuse of the Tanakh, comparing Matthew's usage of the Hebrew Scriptures with that of the early rabbinic writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is his conclusion. This is Gundry's conclusion. And just a monograph, just a book focused on this one subject, the use of the Old Testament in St. Matthew's Gospel, published by a leading European publisher, E.J. Brill, years back. This was his conclusion. Matthean hermeneutics were not atomizing. In other words, Matthew's method of interpretation was not atomizing, meaning just pulling out a verse from there and a verse from there and a verse from there with no connection to the context or the larger meaning. In contrast to Qumran, meaning the Dead Sea Scrolls, and rabbinical literature. In other words, there's a freedom of interpretation and method that we're going to look at later on as we examine the reliability of the New Testament. There was a freedom with which the text was often handled in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in the rabbinic literature. He's saying Matthew was much more sober than that. In other words, it was Matthew who cited verses from the Hebrew Bible with more care for their original context than either the rabbinic writings or the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I've selected a number of key quotes from Matthew, first, second chapters in particular, and then later in the book, to examine these as some of the best examples. Was Matthew a poor interpreter of Scripture? Does Matthew's book of good news indicate that our faith is completely bogus and this guy was trying to create something out of nothing? Or was he, as a Jew, faithful to the Scriptures, coming up with some tremendous insights? Remember, he was taught by the Master himself. He was taught by Messiah himself, who opened his mind to understand. I'm going to say one more thing before we start looking at specific verses. There was an Orthodox Jewish rabbi from northern Israel who became a believer probably late 80s, early 90s. Some disputed whether he was ordained as a rabbi or just a shochet, someone that would oversee ritual supervision of slaughter of animals, kosher slaughter of animals. As far as I understood, he'd been ordained as a rabbi. It didn't matter. He was an Orthodox Jew that was raised in this and had a wonderful encounter with the Lord. His life was changed. And we never advertised it. I was just a guy I got to know and work with. He didn't know much English when he came over to the States, but he was sitting in on a class I was teaching at our Bible college and graduate school that I headed up in Maryland at that time. And to my amazement, it was a class on Messianic prophecy. So he could understand some of what I was saying, but I was constantly referring to the Hebrew Bible, and he had his Tanakh in front of him all the time. And I'd go through some verses, and he'd raise his hand and then just say in Hebrew, I think that's Jesus. You're finding a prophecy there? Go on a few more pages. He says, Yeshua, I think that's Jesus. He was finding Jesus everywhere. In other words, places I would never imagine were prophetic or pointing to him. But his rabbinic method of reading the text was to, for example, reference to Torah and Torah study and the importance of that. They'll find everywhere in the Hebrew Bible. They'll find it everywhere. And now with his same method, his same rabbinic mind, he's reading Tanakh. He's finding Yeshua on every page, every line. I could only smile because I thought I would never even think of some of those as Messianic, but in his mind they were.